The film begins with a man named John Oldman packing his belongings into a pickup truck, preparing to leave his home for good. However, his plans are interrupted when 4 of his university colleagues surprise him with a farewell party. They are puzzled as to why John was planning to leave without even saying goodbye. John simply replies that he doesn't like saying farewells. The group consists of biologist Harry, Christian literature expert Edith, anthropologist Dan, and historian Sandy. John invites his friends into his home, where they question him about his sudden decision to leave after working for 10 years. John responds that he cannot stay in one place for too long, explaining that he has done this many times before. However, his colleagues find it hard to believe, considering he appears to be only 35 years old. Edith jokes, saying that if her age hadn't changed in a decade, any woman would love to know that secret. Meanwhile, archaeology professor Art Jenkins and his student girlfriend, Linda, also arrive at the farewell gathering. Like the others, they question John's decision to leave. John tells them that he enjoys moving forward with the times, but his answer doesn't satisfy anyone. Nonetheless, they wish him well on his next journey. During the conversation, Dan discovers a carved stone, estimated to be between 12,000 and 177,000 years old, a tool used by Cro-Magnons during the Paleolithic era. The group is amazed by the discovery, while John seems slightly uneasy. His colleagues accuse him of creating an air of mystery and urge him to speak openly if he has something to reveal. John admits that he wants to tell them something but has never done so before, unsure of how it will be received. He poses a hypothetical: what if a man from the Upper Paleolithic era had survived until the present day? Dan responds that if such a man had lived for 140 centuries, he would have evolved, gained incredible knowledge, and been curious about every era. But, scientifically, it seems impossible for someone to survive for 14,000 years. Biologist Harry chimes in, saying that while the human body is designed to live up to 190 years, most people die from slow deterioration. However, if a person could completely regenerate their cells, they might live for thousands of years. He explains how certain body cells regenerate quickly, such as those in the pancreas within 24 hours and the stomach lining in 3 days, with the entire body renewing every 7 years. Harry theorizes that if the body could consistently detox and regenerate, it could potentially live for millennia. He adds that at one time, people believed in magic, but now they believe in science. He mentions Christopher Columbus as an example of someone considered mad for pursuing the unknown, only to later be proven right. Suddenly, John shocks everyone by claiming he was on Columbus's ship. He explains that he had already accepted that the Earth was round, though he still had some doubts back then about falling off the edge of the world. His friends, though skeptical, are intrigued, as his story begins to resemble the plot of a science fiction movie. Despite their disbelief, they want to hear more. Harry jokingly asks if John is a Cro-Magnon, and John responds with a strange noise, making everyone laugh. Sandy, who had stepped out to grab some food, returns and asks what she missed. Professor Art informs her that John is claiming to be 14,000 years old. Sandy laughs, telling John to stop joking, as he doesn't look a day over 900. John goes on to reveal that he moves every 10 years, just as people start to notice he doesn't age. He says that after being born thousands of years ago, his aging stopped once he reached the age of 35. He explains how he once led a group of people but was eventually cast out because they believed he was somehow stealing their youth. He adds that he has always been pursued, but never dies, forcing him to live a life constantly on the move. In this way, John joined new tribes as he encountered them and continued moving forward over time. He mentions that the first 2,000 years were incredibly cold, though the weather was warmer at lower altitudes. Gradually, glaciers began to melt, seas formed, and continents drifted apart due to rising sea levels. At this point, Professor Art interrupts him, saying, "We've read all of this in books." John responds by explaining that books help him recall his memories, as it's impossible to remember everything from 14,000 years without them. The conversation eventually shifts to religion, and Linda asks if, in all those 14,000 years, he ever questioned where he came from. John replies that people used to look to the sky and believe that powerful beings controlled everything from above. Initially, he thought his inability to die might mean he was a bad person, but later considered that perhaps he was either cursed or blessed with immortality. His colleagues wonder why he's choosing to reveal the truth to them now. John says he wants to say goodbye as himself, John Oldman, and not as a stranger. As he says this, He begins loading the last of his belongings into the truck. His friends, despite believing he may have a serious psychological issue, still have many questions. They ask John about historical periods, and he tells them that he began walking east, believing it would be warmer there. It was around the beginning of the Bronze Age when he followed trade routes from the east, picking up new languages along the way. During this time, countless myths and gods emerged, so many and so varied, that he eventually realized most of it was probably nonsense. John explains that he spent 2,000 years as a Sumerian before becoming Babylonian during the reign of Hammurabi. He even sailed for a while as a Phoenician. He explains that life was easier when he was a hunter-gatherer, but it became more difficult when villages and city-states emerged, where authority was centralized, and strangers were viewed with suspicion. This made it harder for him to conceal his identity. He learned a few tricks along the way, even faking his own death on a couple of occasions. Despite these challenges, he continued traveling east and eventually reached India, where he met the Buddha. John describes the Buddha as an extraordinary man, unlike anyone he had ever met before, so he became his disciple and stayed with him until his death. The Buddha taught him many new things that John had never considered before. Though they knew there was something different about John, he never revealed the full truth to them. Professor Art then interrupts again, asking what would happen if he told everyone about John's secret. John calmly responds that no one would believe him, they would just call Art crazy. Meanwhile, Professor Art secretly contacts psychiatrist Dr. Will Gruber, suspecting there's something wrong with John. When Dr. Will arrives, he expresses regret that he wasn't there from the beginning of John's story. Upon hearing that John claims to have lived for 14,000 years, the group asks him if he's ever been seriously ill during that time. John reveals that over the centuries, he has suffered from illnesses such as yellow fever, typhoid, smallpox, and the Black Plague. Will, puzzled, asks why John doesn't bear any scars from smallpox. John explains that his body never retained scars. When asked about his education, John admits that he has earned 10 degrees, including a degree in biology from Oxford in 1840, though the knowledge back then was limited. Will, still skeptical, mentions that, according to Professor Art, 14,000 years ago, John's tribe had expelled him because they believed he was stealing their years. Maybe it's true, Will says. Maybe you're a vampire with that. Will points his revolver at John, stating he wants to test whether John can really die. John calmly reminds him that he never claimed immortality, acknowledging that he might die someday. Will eventually backs down and leaves. At that point, Harry, still grieving the recent loss of his wife to cancer, lashes out, becoming more confrontational. John follows Will outside to de-escalate the situation, offering him comfort and gently requesting the revolver, only to discover that the gun was never loaded. When John returns, Dan asks if he thinks there could be others like him who have also survived through the ages. John recalls meeting a man in the 16th century who seemed similar to him, so he shared his story with him. The two had a brief, 2-day friendship where they discussed their pasts and shared their doubts. However, distrust remained and they parted ways. John later saw him again, 200 years later, at a train station in Brussels, but the man disappeared into the crowd. The conversation shifts to religion. Dan asks if John has ever been religious. John admits he no longer follows any established religion, nor does he feel the need to believe in God. He doesn't deny God's existence, but believes that if God does exist, he might be present all around us. Continuing with the theme, Dan asks if John has ever met any significant figures from religious history. John answers yes, but hesitates to elaborate, noting that the conversation is heading in an uncomfortable direction. Pressed further, John finally reveals that many stories in the Bible are myths rooted in historical events. Hearing this, Edith, a devout believer, becomes visibly upset and threatens to leave, but her friends manage to convince her to stay. John continues, explaining that he admired the Buddha's teachings and contemplated them for 500 years. Later, he lived as an Etruscan before assimilating into the Roman Empire, but was soon overwhelmed by the chaos of wars and massacres. He then moved to the Near East, wondering if he could present the Buddha's philosophy in a more contemporary form. In doing so, he inadvertently rebelled against Rome, leading to his crucifixion by the Empire. At this point, Edith is horrified and accuses John of claiming to be Jesus Christ. John clarifies that the legend of Jesus arose after his crucifixion. He explains that he had learned techniques in Tibet and India to block pain and slow his bodily processes. As a result, his followers mistakenly believed he had died. They removed him from the cross and placed him in a cave, and after some time, his body returned to its normal state. He quietly left, but by the time he ascended to Central Europe, the legend of Christ's resurrection had already spread. After hearing this, everyone's emotions reach a breaking point. Art demands that John show them the marks of crucifixion, but John reminds them that his body never retained scars. He further reveals that Christianity shares many similarities with pagan beliefs, which deeply upsets Edith. Dan tries to comfort her by explaining that early Christian leaders discarded Hebrew manuscripts and borrowed extensively from pagan sources. He also highlights the similarities between the teachings of Buddha and Jesus Christ's values like compassion, tolerance, brotherhood, and love. John affirms that this was the message he tried to spread in the past, but over time, priests twisted these teachings, introducing concepts like heaven and hell to control people through fear. Just then, Will returns, clearly embarrassed. He asks John where the name Jesus originated. John explains that he always went by the name John, but when rumors of his resurrection spread, people confused his name with the Hebrew meaning of Joseph, God is merciful. Over time, his name became associated with Yeshua, meaning God is salvation, eventually evolving into Jesus through ancient Greek and Latin translations. Edith, still distraught, angrily insists that John could never have been Jesus. John admits that he never performed miracles like turning water into wine or raising the dead. He has healed a few people using Eastern medicine, but he never claimed that God was his father. However, Edith still refuses to believe he was Jesus. John recounts a time when, during a Sermon on a Mount, he asked the people what they thought of him and who they believed he was. He gave them the freedom to choose what they wanted to believe, the same choice he now offers to his colleagues. At this, Edith breaks down in tears. Will steps in, saying that things have gone too far, and for the sake of everyone, John should admit the truth. After a moment of thought, John apologizes and explains that the entire story was just a fabrication, causing everyone except Sandy to leave in disappointment. Sandy, who loves John unrequitedly, stays behind, suspecting that John wasn't lying. She asks him how many times he's changed his name. John says he has only ever changed his surname unbeknownst to them. Will is listening nearby. John goes on to explain that he adopted the name John Thomas Partee when he taught at Harvard nearly 60 years ago. Will, in shock, still doesn't believe it but is visibly shaken. John continues, admitting that Will's mother's name was Nola and that their family dog was named Woy. At this, Will breaks down, sobbing uncontrollably, asking why John left him and his mother all those years ago. John replies that he moves with time, that's just what he does. Will, overwhelmed with emotion, suffers a heart attack and dies. For the first time in 14,000 years, John experiences the death of his own son. Grief-stricken, he returns to his truck and prepares to leave for another new destination. But after driving a few meters, he stops and invites Sandy, who loves him despite knowing he will inevitably leave her one day, to join him.